The boardroom fell silent, as if the city itself had stopped breathing. Glass turned to a plate of reflected faces. The projector light painted Alexander Ashcroft's jawline in a cold corporate halo. He had been talking about legacy, about how their company, under his stewardship, gave back to the community. When his words drained away, he blinked once, then twice, and his hands fumbled at the podium like a man suddenly unmoored. The applause hiccuped and died. Someone muttered. A woman in a navy suit reached for the water glass. Alexander's shoulders slumped, and he folded forward with a sound that thrilled like a snapped wire. Bernard Kellerman was 2 floors down, finishing the last sweep of the hallway. He heard the commotion before anyone else did, a scattering of high-strung voices, the muffled clack of shoes down marble stairs, and he came up the corridor. He'd been the building's night janitor for 12 years, a man who knew the pipes and the ductwork, who could tell the difference between a coffee stain and a chemical spill with a fingertip. He carried a bucket and a mop, a metal ring of keys that jingled like a small confession. When the crowd parted, rich suits, PR flunky faces, the curated concern of the executive suite, Bernard saw Alexander on the floor, blue returning to his lips like a bad print. The corporate camera phones hovered, then wavered, searching for an angle. Bernard didn't think about optics. He knelt. He checked the carotid pulse with a practiced thumb. He told the room, loud enough for the security guard to hear, "Call 911. He began compressions. There was no drama to his hands, only muscle memory. He pressed, hard, slowly, counting in his head. The building hummed with a dozen cameras. The nearest executive coughed, as if embarrassed to watch a janitor so rudely intrude on a collapse. Someone tried to pull Bernard away. "Sir, step back, give him space," Marcus, the head of security, barked, not friendly. Bernard ignored him. He had been a father for a long time. Nothing sharpens urgency like the thought of losing the person in front of you. Paramedics would later say his compressions were textbook. A nurse on the board, who had been giving a presentation on shareholder returns, rolled up her sleeves and helped with breaths. Someone fished a defibrillator from behind a credenza, its pads placed, hum and thunder. For a long minute that felt like walking underwater, Bernard kept the rhythm as the room unfroze around him. When Alexander drew an uneven breath and coughed, someone screamed like an animal relieved. Camera phones lifted, and the flash of 100 devices burst across Bernard's jacket. He was still kneeling, palms pressed to the billionaire's chest, hair slick with sweat in the fluorescent light. A PR associate, Fiona Redford, pale, efficient, stepped forward with a crisp envelope.
Tyler Brigham, the CFO, who'd been calculating liabilities at the exact moment Alexander had fallen, leaned in with a thought already formed. "Get him to pose," Tyler said. "A photo. Take his picture with the check. Show him rewarded." The phrase hung there like a verdict. "Kneel for cash," someone joked nervously. The words meant to be a clever headline, not an instruction. Alexander's eyes, blurred from recent oxygen, focused and then fluttered like a flag. He was a father. There were framed photographs of a boy on his desk that everyone had seen in the glossy profiles, and he heard the suggested solution as some simple paternal absolution. "Give him," he murmured, not fully confident in his own mouth. "Have him take it." Bernard felt the paper, felt a hand push something toward him, a thick envelope, maybe a check. Then the clicking of cameras intensified, eager for an image the PR team could spin, a humble janitor kneeling while the billionaire rewards him. The executing of the shot was quick, mechanical, like a staged advertisement. Bernard's knees were already on the marble. The camera froze the posture. The photo would later be cropped into 1,000 stories, tagged into millions of feeds, polished into an icon that would not tell the whole truth. He accepted the envelope because his hands were still busy. He had not understood the performance they wanted. He only knew he had used the last of his strength to keep a man alive. He rose when told, awkward, palms still slightly tremulous from compressions. People clapped. Someone handed him a bottle of water like an afterthought. Alexander's eyes found him, and for a small, honest beat, there was gratitude there, raw, fragile. Then the room shifted back into rehearsed civility. Press releases, statements, the scripted concern of people whose livelihood depended on optics. That image, the kneeling, the envelope, would not stay innocent. It would be pried into pieces. If you want the full turnaround, subscribe. This story gets even stranger. At first, the company did what it does best. It smoothed. Fiona drafted a short internal memo thanking staff and building personnel for their quick actions. Tyler arranged a staged photo to appear on the company's social channels under the caption, "Our Community Heroes." It was polished, tasteful, and the kind of payoff corporations liked, enough to avoid lawsuit and bolstering brand tenderness for shareholders. But someone at the company was already worried about optics in a different sense. There was a long business meeting the next day, a quarterly review in which investors would ask about risk and liability. Tyler, who had turned a habit of seeing people as numbers into a career, sat with a narrow mouth that did not reveal embarrassment, only calculation. We can't have the narrative be that a sanitation worker was saving the CEO, he told Fiona in a hallway lined with glossy awards.
He could see headlines: security lacks, courtroom drama, class division. A better headline, he thought, would frame Bernard as a great recipient of charity, not as a man who made them look vulnerable. Tyler was a man who understood the internet the way other people understood weather, an uncontrollable force you had to respect or it would drown you. He authorized an internal leak to a friendly blogger, an image carefully cropped to emphasize the envelope, a caption that suggested Bernard was kneeling to accept a handout, a shadow of a query about whether he had staged the event to get money. The blogger ran with it. Within hours, a screenshot of Bernard's kneel appeared under a deceptive headline. Social feeds took it up. A late-night comic, never kind to people who dared to be human in the presence of sitting power, live-streamed a mocking sketch. A trend coalesced as humans online found confirmation for an instinct they already had: the powerful give, the powerless receive. The nuance of breathless hands and a man's trained response to cardiac arrest dissolved under the weight of a single image in a dozen short, gleeful takes. Bernard turned his phone off, unaware of the storm. He went back to the night shift and thought of the crisp envelope shoved into his jacket pocket. It would pay the heating bill for a month. It would let Molly have a coat that wouldn't make her shiver in the bus line. He did not know the cameras had framed him into something else. By the time morning came, his union rep called. "We got a directive from HR," the man said with reluctance. There was a formal meeting with Marcus on one side, large, steady, his posture a uniform of force, and Therese from Human Resources on the other, with a stack of printed statements. Bernard sat in a chair that was meant to make him feel small, and tried to keep his face calm. "You were in an unsecured area, Mr. Kellerman," Therese read. "You interfered with an emergency protocol." Marcus's report leaned on policy. The building's rules, clause after clause, were recited in a tone that was supposed to sound like impartial governance. No one at that table said thank you. No one watched his shoulders fall. They offered a severance. They worded it as if it were charity, a check for 3 months, with a clause that would keep any mention of the company's involvement off the record. Bernard signed because it was all he could guess to do. The envelope in his jacket pocket felt heavier afterward. It was a pledge of silence dressed as compensation. Word spread through other channels. Someone, an inside source with a taste for self-preservation, shared a cropped photo with a blogger who liked outrage. That blogger published an article with a headline that called Bernard a hustler, a man who kneeled for cash. The comment section grew teeth. "Scam artist," the top comment read. Someone wrote, "He only did it for money." Another suggested it was all staged to get a payday. A tag trended, #KneelForCash. Bernard's modest world shrank into a series of bureaucratic humiliations. He was called to the precinct after an anonymous complaint alleging trespassing during the collapse. The officer was polite but swift. Protocol had to be followed. A background check, routine, the officer said, brought up a sealed misdemeanor from nearly 20 years before, a petty theft charge that had been expunged but still existed in a noisy corner of digital records. Tyler, living in another building a few blocks away, received the leak and smiled thinly at the image of the boardroom's vulnerability being erased by a smear that felt surgical. Damage control, he called it. We pivot the narrative. We protect the brand. At home, Bernard opened the heavy envelope and found not a check, but a company-issued card, and tucked behind it, a brief note printed on stock paper. With appreciation. No details. The card would pay for an emergency hotel night and a handful of bills, but not much more. It was a kindness without roots. His daughter, Molly, was 8, with a chubby face and a stubborn fist of heart. She stood at the doorway of their rent-squeezed apartment in a pink hoodie that had seen better middles. Molly believed in straight answers. "Did you save him, Daddy?" she asked, eyes wide and blunt. It was the kind of question children ask, the sort that expects cosmic order. "Yes," Bernard said. He put the envelope on the counter and made 2 eggs for her breakfast, butter sizzling. He tasted the salt of his own worry in the steam. He tucked the company card into a drawer. He had bills to pay, but for school lunches, then the landlord, then the bus fare to a new temp job if he could find one. He smiled the way one practices a skill. Janet Holloway, his neighbor, and an elder who had lived in the building across the hall for 30 years, popped her head in that morning with a thermos and a blunt question. "They fire you for saving someone?" she asked, in a voice that carried the right amount of righteous disbelief to warm him. "They said I breached protocol," Bernard replied. He set a plate on the table and watched Molly eat. She chewed like she was trying to swallow the world. The smear made everything worse. A foreman in a nearby school system called when he saw the headlines and said they had a vacancy for a cleaner. It paid barely enough, but it was honest. Bernard cleaned classrooms and took home a check, and in the evenings he watched videos of the event with the neighbors when they gathered around a small TV. They cheered at the defibrillator clip, but winced at the still photo that had morphed him into a stereotype.
Tyler's campaign did its work with the ruthless efficacy of a well-trained machine. He briefed a PR contingency, leaked the expunged blot, seed doubt, filter everything through a lens of security concerns. A few op-eds suggested Bernard's actions were suspicious. Did he have a motive?
Which in the minds of people who rarely pause to read past headlines translated into a verdict. Online trolls dug back into his record and found old social media posts, photos of him at a union rally a decade earlier, and turned them into evidence of a life lived for attention. The smear liked the smell of old cautionary tales. It slapped them together and sold them. Bernard kept his dignity, because it was, in small doses, all he had to offer his daughter. He refused to go on television. He refused to sell his version of events for money. He wanted only to work, to provide, to be the man Molly expected when she lifted a drawing of their two faces and declared it us. But other people traded in his dignity for narratives, and fiction moved faster than truth. One cold afternoon, as Bernard was sweeping a side entrance, a man in a tailored coat approached and asked for directions. Then, when Bernard blinked up, went still. "You're the man who saved Alexander Ashcroft?" he asked. Bernard nodded. The man's eyes were the practiced gray of a reporter who has seen 1,000 stories. "Do you have a comment?" he asked. Bernard shook his head and kept sweeping. He had been asked for comments before, once by a local paper, once by a gossip column that promised they wanted the real story. Their cameras had waited outside his building and turned his daughter's shy smile into an accessory for their clicks. He would not feed them again. By the time the smear had grown enough teeth to threaten a bite, Alexander's world had already narrowed into a single image he could not shake, Bernard's hands pressing into his chest, the crooked rhythm of someone who had no right to be the center of an annual report, but had become so by force of reflex. That memory lived on an unshared tape in his phone. He watched at night when the house was otherwise empty, when the word philanthropy sounded like a hollow bell. Alexander was an astute man who knew the cost of a headline and the price of silence. For a few days he let the company handle the fallout. That was the way the world ran. PR drafted, legal filed, media circled. But pictures carried their own gravity. He replayed the moments before he blacked out. He watched the way Bernard knelt to compress, and the way his hand shook at the last exhale. He saw the staged photo and felt it wrong in his chest, like a bruise forming. He was, above all, a father. There was a framed photograph on his nightstand of his son at 7, grinning with a missing tooth. The photograph had no use now but to make him feel smaller when he compared it to the image of Bernard in the envelope. The thought came to him like a splinter. What would he do if that photo of his son were crumpled into a smear to erase a life? He felt personal culpability, not merely for having been the subject of the staged image, but for allowing the machinery that called itself his to shape a narrative that swallowed another man.
At a board meeting that followed, someone joked about the optics, and someone else laughed to keep the squeal of panic out of their throat. Tyler suggested a final push, a donation to a charity that would, in a single move, fix the brand. Alexander listened, his jaw set. He felt the weight of the photo pressed down like an accusation. There was an ember of something inside him, an emotion he had not budgeted for among balance sheets, an irritation at how easily a man's life could be recast. That night, in the privacy of his house, Alexander pulled up the full, unedited footage, the heat haze of the projector lights, the quick efficiency of the nurse, Bernard's hands like a metronome. The cropped image looked callous, in affront. He rewound and stared at the envelope's angle, the way the light had hit it to make it gleam. It looked staged. He felt a fury that was not only corporate, but personal, an ugly twist that he had been reduced to an object, and Bernard to a prop. He called Fiona and asked for the original file. No edits. He texted Tyler, terse. "Bring me everything," he wrote. Fiona's voice on the phone was steady. "We handled the release as we should have." Tyler had already replied, "Don't worry, narrative under control." Their voices were trained apparatuses to smooth a world made of difficult edges. Alexander didn't like the sound of their certainty. He watched the footage again and again until the house grew thin around him. He sat at the kitchen table under the same dim light as his son had sat to color inside the lines, and he made a decision that to him felt divisive in the way that important things often do. He would go see the man who had saved his life, not for optics, not for a staged photograph, for a reckoning he felt in his gut, a need to reconcile a profane headline with a real human hand pressed against a chest. He called his assistant and asked where the janitor lived. He asked for an address of the building's employees. He asked for a name. When the assistant hesitated, citing HR protocols, he said simply, "Find him. This is personal." He did not yet know what he would say to Bernard. He did not know whether Bernard would want anything from him beyond privacy and a job.
He did not yet know whether Bernard would accept an apology wrapped in a company press release. He only knew that the image had become a wound. He intended to find with his presence whether the wound could be stitched. As his driver pulled into the neighborhood where Bernard lived, rows of tired brick and laundromats whose neon signs had long ago dropped half their bulbs, Alexander looked out at streets he rarely noticed. Cleaners folded in storefronts, a church sign with an evening prayer, a barbershop with a kid's chair caked in hair. He felt like a man stepping into a different country.
Upstairs in a cramped apartment, Bernard buckled Molly's mouthguard before soccer practice and tightened the laces on her sneakers with fingers that had minutes ago scrubbed coffee stains from a boardroom carpet and hours before will scrub floors in a school. He kissed her forehead, the little ritual that made them both sleep calmer that night. When the door shut and the city noise turned into a low pulse, he sat on the edge of a sagging couch and opened a letter from the landlord. Eviction. The word printed on stamped paper had a static power of its own. He pressed his hand flat to it, as if he could smooth out the future by will. He stacked bills and tried to keep the panic to a manageable hum. He had thought to go to a temp agency that week. He kept putting it off. He could not find time to be more than one kind of man. Work took all of him, and the child took the rest. There was a knock at his door that night. Bernard wiped his hands on his pants and went to open it, expecting the usual: a neighbor, a charity flyer, Janet with some stew. Instead, a car idled outside with glossy paint and a driver in a suit. A man stepped onto the stoop. A man with a face Bernard had seen in photographs. He had the same narrow look as someone who never had to choose between dinner and rent. For a moment, Bernard thought the universe had a terrible sense of comedy. The man did not have to knock twice. "Mr. Kellerman," the man asked, and something behind his voice said he had rehearsed this line. Bernard's first instinct was to close the door. He positioned himself between the threshold and the world the man carried with him: a press team, an emergency of reputation, perhaps a check with strings. He remembered the envelope on his counter and his daughter's tiny fist. He remembered the way a photograph could steal a life. "What do you want?" he said, and his voice did not tremble as much as he expected. The man studied him as if learning the contour of a problem. Behind him, through the dim, Alexander's driver waited in the car like a promise. Alexander himself, tired eyes, suit bagged at the elbows from a long day, lifted his chin. "I wanted to say thank you," he said, words that held a history of press releases in their pauses. "In person." Bernard held the door a fraction wider. He had saved a life. He had been punished for it. He had been turned into a meme. He had been offered severance for severance. He had the capacity to accept a thank you and nothing more. He had already accepted a card. Accepting the man who now stood before him would be different. It would be stepping into the narrative again. It would be letting the world see him as someone else had been allowed to be seen. Behind the man, lights flashed briefly from a corner of the street where a stranger had already pointed a camera, a reflex of a culture that could not resist documentation. The image of a wealthy man saying thank you to a janitor on a stoop would not be clean.
It would be edited, clicked, rephrased. Bernard's life had been invaded in ways money did not fix. Alexander took out a hand, not an envelope. He did not present a check as a prop, nor did he offer a staged photo op. He held out the one thing that had been denied to Bernard in the minutes and hours after the incident: his unmediated attention. "Are you all right?" he asked, and it was a question the world had never quite taught him to ask without an audience. Bernard looked at the hand and then at the man who had fainted in a boardroom under the glow of 100 cameras. He thought of Molly and the landlord's letter and the card in the drawer. He thought of the viral headlines that had gnawed a new shape into his life. He felt the weight of the door behind him, the threshold between two economies. One where a man's life could be reduced to a caption, and the other where a life could be held in the patient counting of compressions. He stepped back, and for a breath, just a breath, the space between the two men held like a paused frame in a film that hadn't decided whether to cut or to linger. For a long breath neither man moved. The humid night air pressed against the stoop like a thin sheet. A car idling 2 doors down coughed to life and then went silent. Somewhere behind the building a child laughed, and the sound landed like a bell that reminded Bernard he had a daughter waiting for dinner, and a soccer practice, and the landlord's paper on the counter. Alexander lingered on the threshold, as if the precise shape of the moment could teach him how to be useful. He smelled faintly of the boardroom, cedar polish, coffee gone bitter. But closer, his suit had a worn place at the elbow where he always rubbed it when thinking. He seemed smaller than the photographs that had made him famous, the refractive facade of a man in headlines. There was a rawness to his voice when he finally spoke. No rehearsed cadence, no press team polish. "I want to know what you need," he said. The sentence was more urgent than apology. It had the humility of someone finally learning the true cost of an image. Bernard kept his hand on the doorknob. He thought of the envelope in the drawer, of the card with the company logo that had pretended to be kindness.
He thought of Molly's toothbrush in a plastic cup in the bathroom and the stack of unpaid notices. He had spent a week practicing how to say no without making whatever dignity he had left collapse. He had also spent a lifetime learning to take care of people who could not take care of themselves. "What I need," he answered slowly, "is for this to stop being about a photo and start being about what actually happened. I saved a man's life. That's not a headline." The man with the narrow face, Alexander, nodded like a man who had been waiting to be told a truth he already half suspected. He reached into his jacket and this time did not bring out an envelope.
He brought out his phone and a small, battered notebook, and after a long breath, he said, "Then I'll make it about what happened." When he said those words, there was no camera choreography on the stoop, no PR handler with a pre-approved message. There was a man who had felt his own mortality in a boardroom and had seen another man's hands keep him from the edge. Alexander asked whether Bernard would meet him, not in a staged press conference or as the subject of a corporate video, but across a table, privately, so the rest of the narrative could start from a place that felt like truth. Bernard hesitated for a long, honest second. He could take the meeting and end up a prop in a different scene. He could refuse and continue to be a cursed curiosity. He remembered Molly's question that morning. "Did you save him, Daddy?" He wanted to teach her that integrity meant refusing to let other people write your biography for you. "All right," he said. "One meeting." They went to a small cafe 2 blocks from the building instead of the Ashcroft Tower. It was the kind of place that kept a jar of local newspapers behind the counter and played an old jazz record faintly so that the world felt less sharp. Bernard ate his eggs slowly and watched Alexander watch him. The billionaire's hands trembled when he reached for a cup, raw nerves under a suit. There was no photographer at their table, and for the first time since the collapse, Bernard realized someone in the room had to carry the courage to be real. "Can you tell me everything?" Alexander asked, voice low enough that they did not have to fear an eavesdropper who might twist the words. Bernard told him the rhythm of the compressions, the way the nurse had slid into the work like a second set of hands, the moment the defibrillator had thundered and the life had returned. He told him about being pulled back by Marcus, about the joke that had become a headline, about the leak in the cropped photo, and the hashtag that turned a life-saving act into a punchline. He told him about the union rep's phone call, the severance paper, the sealed misdemeanor dredged up by a curious investigator. Alexander listened and watched his face change with each piece of the story. Guilt sharpened to anger, anger to resolve. He asked about Fiona and Tyler, about the internal releases and the blog that had first pushed the cropped photo. Bernard answered with what he knew and what he didn't, with the kind of economy required by people who live inside a world where facts often get rewritten. When they finished, Alexander rubbed his thumb along the rim of the ceramic mug like someone rubbing a coin to see whether it still felt metal. "I don't want to control how you tell this," he said at last. "I want to make sure nobody can keep this version of you from being true." He kept his promise. Not with a staged statement or a PR video, but with the small administrative cruelties companies used to hide from the public. He called Fiona and asked for the original, unedited footage. He demanded that legal set aside any clause that would force Bernard into silence if he accepted compensation. He reached out to the head of HR and said he wanted Bernard's termination reversed pending an investigation. He authorized immediate medical bills to be cleared and organized a meeting with a social worker who could help with housing and benefits, things the company finance team had previously called non-core expenditures. Word of the visit leaked fast. That was the nature of their world. Things traveled in thin threads and sometimes brightened suddenly when someone tugged. The press, hungry for drama, smelled another angle. But there was a crucial difference now. The man at the center of the controversy was calling the shots. Fiona, efficient and guarded, at first resisted the reopening of everything. "We drafted a careful communication schedule," she told Alexander in a voice that had the crispness of someone who had been trained to move reputation like chess pieces. "If we go in guns blazing, we give them more oxygen. We can do a controlled release, donation, appreciation, an event that frames this as community spirit." Alexander had seen the way her mouth shaped itself around corporate words. He had learned the syntax of spin. He chose another tactic. "No," he said, "we will show what actually happened. Not the cropped photo, not a press release that buries the truth under a program. The whole footage, names, the mistakes, our part of it, and we will clear Bernard's record in writing, publicly." Fiona's breath hitched. "That will be messy," she warned. Tyler will have to answer for what he did," Alexander said. He did not speak triumphantly. He spoke like someone committing to a consequence that might cost him more than he wanted. If someone weaponized a picture to deliberately change a man's life, then we own that and we will fix it.
Tyler Brigham, when he was told what Alexander proposed, followed the route a man whose career had been built on controlling narratives would take. He pushed back. He argued that the business needed a stabilizing statement and that unspooling the internal decisions about leaks and cropping would invite lawsuits, investor panic, and a storm of unhelpful attention. He said bluntly that the company's stock and reputation had to be protected. "You're asking us to trade the company's market position for what?" he demanded, speaking as if numbers could equal humanity. "For the illusion of public virtue? We don't run a charity, we run a company. There are stakeholders." Alexander's reply was not a boardroom rebuke. It was quieter and far more consequential. "We run a company that relies on people whose lives matter."
If our brand is built on the idea of community, let community be more than an advertising line. Tyler did not surrender quietly. He started to prepare his own defense, and in the way men like him operate, he began to dig into the history of the man who had become known as the janitor who kneeled. He scrolled through old files, legal memos, human resources notes, and in the dusty margins he found a sealed, blotchy line, a minor offense from 2 decades ago, expunged in the ordinary way the system sometimes allowed. He found old social media posts from Bernard's youth and a union rally photograph, and he started to assemble an alternative narrative he thought the public would accept. A man who had always been a troublemaker, now opportunistically profiting off a rescue. Tyler's push was predictable in its coldness. He briefed a blogger who had in the past favored simplified outrage and fed them a cropped screenshot of the boardroom. He leaked a public string of documents meant to insinuate pattern where no pattern existed. The smear machine clicked again. A late-night pundit joked that Bernard had mastered the art of turning tragedy into profit. The hashtag reappeared, this time with different teeth.
The misdemeanor, it turned out, had been a youthful mistake, expunged and contextual, a theft from a construction site that had been a desperate act of a different life and had long been legally settled. Bernard felt the bite of it, not in the air of public conversation, but in the small humiliations that followed. A landlord who had been cautious before called and left a voicemail where kindness unclipped into formality. A temporary job that had seemed possible suddenly closed a slot when a supervisor disclosed that the building's clients were sensitive to bad press. The tether to dignity frayed in slow, quiet ways. That was when the community rose. Janet rallied neighbors and organized a small demonstration outside the tower, their placards crude but earnest. "Thank you, Bernard." A local pastor gathered signatures. A school teacher who had once received a helping hand from Bernard's cleaning crew wrote a letter to the editor. Social media, when shown the full footage, had people pushing back against the pylons. Donations arrived from strangers in small increments to cover an overdue heating bill. The state assemblywoman of the district requested a meeting with Alexander to discuss clearer protections for building staff during emergencies, an idea that began as a political stroke and then became something earnest in the moment it found an ear. When Alexander finally brought Bernard back into the Ashcroft offices, it was not for a staged press event. There were cameras, yes, reporters had come, but Alexander had refused the newsroom's demand for a tableau. He asked for a simple, verifiable action, a written clearing signed by him, filed with the company, and sent publicly, to be followed by a genuine offer to re-employ Bernard in a capacity that mattered. A leave role designing an employee welfare office, an independent program to protect building staff, janitorial teams, cafeteria workers, and low-wage employees across the company's properties. It was a bold offer, because it asked Bernard to take a place inside the very machine that had nearly eroded his life, an unusual restitution that aimed not at charity but at structural repair. The job would not be a sinecure. Bernard will be given a team, a budget, and authority to implement emergency pay plans, to create an anonymous reporting line for abusive managers, to secure temporary housing grants, and to ensure that security protocols allowed trained responders to act without punitive retaliation. Bernard hesitated. He had never wanted to be a symbol. He had wanted to sweep floors and tuck his daughter into bed. The idea of sitting in an office in the same building that had severed him felt like stepping onto an old stage with new lights, but the thought of being able to change the policy that had been used as a weapon against him, of preventing another person from being silenced by a press release or a severance clause, gnawed at him.
He could walk away with charity, or he could try to rebuild from within. "I don't want a photo op," he said plainly in their meeting. "I don't want to be used so you can sleep easy at night." "You won't be," Alexander replied. "You'll have full autonomy, no PR strings, a real budget, the power to hire your own people, to bring in union representatives if you want them. If I'm buying you back into my company, it's because I want you to change how we act." The meeting took place with a lawyer present, with Marcus quietly at the edge and Janet in the audience for moral support. Bernard's acceptance came with conditions: no gag clause, union representatives invited in the formation of the office, and full transparency in funding. Alexander agreed. Fiona, who had watched the process with a professional wariness, signed off reluctantly, but then did something that surprised Bernard. She offered to help him set up the first outreach program, away from any press interference. Tyler, sensing a loss of control, pushed harder. He leaked excerpts of Bernard's past social media, spun them into a narrative of opportunism, and tried to force a public debate about whether the company had rewarded vice. The tactic was old and brittle. It excited tabloids for a morning, and then fell flat against the steady facts that showed nothing of a lifelong pattern, only a man who had made small mistakes many years ago that did not define his adult life. What broke Tyler's forward thrust was less a PR counterattack and more a set of facts Alexander chose to release: the notarized footage, a transparent accounting of the company's decision-making process, and a short, bitter memo from Alexander himself, acknowledging how he had allowed the company's optics to overshadow a human act. Alexander asked for internal audits into how the footage had been cropped and how the narrative had been shaped. He demanded accountability. The board bristled, and Tyler bristled louder. At the next internal hearing, evidence surfaced that suggested Tyler had authorized certain leaks to shape a narrative the company approved behind closed doors. The board, fearing the slow erosion of trust more than Tyler's arguments, asked him to step down pending an inquiry. Tyler left as all men like him do, eloquent in his indignation, certain that he had served shareholders. His departure did not wipe away every worry or heal every cut, but it removed a prominent engine that had fueled the smear and made space for the more workmanlike labor of repair. Bernard's job began in the grittier hours, meeting building staff in back rooms, listening. He went to places PR would never visit: a basement kitchen where a cafeteria worker kept her winter's savings in a jar, a room where a security officer confessed she had been told to look the other way when contractors had been abused, the cramped office where a cleaning team had been denied overtime despite dangerous conditions.
Bernard learned to ask simple questions that uncovered tangled policies. Who gets paid when a building closes for a holiday? Who gets emergency pay if someone is injured? What happens when a worker performs life-saving aid? He did not bring ideology so much as a father's practical concern. When a single mother told him how she had missed rent because a payroll glitch had never been corrected, Bernard found ways to make the payroll system fix itself. When a night guard told him that security often treated janitorial staff like intruders, Bernard constructed training sessions that used real-life scenarios and included legal counsel on workers' rights. He built an emergency fund that could be accessed the same day a worker needed housing or medical care, and he insisted that the fund be administered by a committee that included staff representatives rather than the company's PR wing. Change was incremental and sometimes frustrating. There were bureaucratic hurdles. There were weeks when the office had more meetings than money, and weeks when grants were slow to materialize. But some early wins were concrete and immediate. A cafeteria team whose hazardous cleaning supplies were replaced with safer alternatives. A school contract where custodians' hours were adjusted so overtime could be avoided. Temporary housing for a janitor who had suffered a home fire, and reinstatements for several staff members who had been terminated in the swept-up panic after the collapse. The first-year reports were sober and meaningful. The emergency fund had distributed grants to 72 families in need. The anonymous reporting line had logged 189 complaints, leading to 43 managerial reviews. And a living wage pilot across 3 buildings had improved retention rates and reduced overtime demands. The headlines shifted from the sneer of a viral moment to reports about policy and modest triumphs. People began to tell the stories of lives changed in small, luminous ways. A mother who no longer skipped meals so her children could eat. A mechanic who no longer feared retaliation after reporting a safety hazard. Each victory was a stitch in a new fabric, tentative but real. Bernard became, awkwardly at first, a public face, never a poster boy, but a man who had learned to speak plainly about what was required. He refused glossy interviews and opt-outs. Instead, he accepted invitations to speak at small gatherings, to sit on panels with union organizers, to testify at a local council hearing about worker protections. He told stories about the night he had pressed a chest and felt the world wobble. He told them not for sympathy, but to reveal the gap between human action and corporate response. At a public forum convened by the city's labor committee, Alexander sat in the 3rd row and listened. He had learned to let others speak and to take his cue from the people who had been overlooked.
When Bernard rose to present the preliminary plan for the Employee Welfare Office, his voice did not tremble in the way a man made to represent others often does. It steadied. "We aren't asking for charity," he said into the microphone, looking briefly to the balcony where Janet and Molly sat. "We're asking for structural respect. If someone saves a life in your building, you don't fine them for stepping over a policy. You don't leak their past. You make sure the next time the world needs an ordinary person to act, we don't punish them for doing what human beings ought to do." There were tears in the room when he finished, not because anyone needed to weep at rhetoric, but because people recognized a truth that had been shorn in clips, that dignity matters more than images. Opposition remained. There were conservative pundits who argued that corporations could not be held to social experiments, investors who disliked the short-term costs of the welfare office, and a handful of harried managers who thought the new reporting lines slowed down efficiency. But each time a complaint was made, the company published transparent audits, slow, sometimes clumsy, but honest. It became harder for detractors to point to the initial image and claim it told the whole story. The narrative had widened. At home, the changes were subtler and deeply human. Molly's world shifted in practical ways. The rent that had once been a constant source of fear now became paid on time with a steadiness that made the nights less jagged. Bernard would come home with paperwork and uncomfortable stories, but he also came home with small gifts, an extra jacket for Molly when September turned cold, a ticket to a minor league game that she loved. He never let their life become sanctified in any way. He kept the ordinary rhythms intact: breakfast, school drop-off, a quick sweep before a meeting. The dignity of an ordinary routine mattered after the window had shown the wreckage of a day. There were moments of awkwardness, too. Reporters still tugged at scarves and asked for a quote. Social media posts rehashed the old hashtag in thin jokes that reappeared like stubborn weeds. Once, a late-night host made a quip, and Bernard watched the clip with Molly curled at his side, her small fingers drawing patterns on his jeans. She looked up at him with the kind of purity that made grown men reconsider the worth of their anger. "Daddy," she said simply, "you did something brave." The work of the welfare office grew from small grants to policy innovations. Bernard insisted the office measure the results in real metrics: reduced staff turnover, fewer workplace injuries, a faster emergency response time for workers who needed it.
He partnered with local nonprofits to create a transitional housing program for employees in crises, worked with legal clinics to provide low-cost counsel, and launched an apprenticeship program for youngsters who wanted to learn skilled trades and avoid exploitative temp agency cycles. These innovations were not glamorous, but their impact showed. Retention rates rose at the pilot sites, complaints about retaliation fell. Employees who had once been afraid to speak up now had an institutional mechanism to do so. There were symbolic moments that matched the quiet victories. The first time Alexander visited the welfare office, not as a man in crisis but as an ally, he sat in a plastic chair with Bernard and listened as staff explained their problems. The patriarchal image of a millionaire bestowing favors was replaced by something narrower and truer, two men from different worlds learning to do the tedious work of repair. Alexander attended a community meeting where ordinary workers stood and described lives saved by a small stipend from the emergency fund. He left the meeting not triumphant but humbled. When the city council publicly praised the Ashcroft welfare pilot as a model for other companies, Bernard felt both pride and a strange discomfort. He thought of the way a single image had almost ended his life and the lives of the people he loved. He thought of Tyler's smugness. He thought of Fiona and Alexander and the way each had altered their course. Tyler, in his departure, had not simply vanished into history. He sued the company, claiming wrongful termination, and contested many of the internal findings. The legal fight was noisy and complex. It took months and made for clumsy headlines. But the company had prepared evidence, email trails, internal memos, and witnesses who testified to a campaign to shape a narrative in ways that had been deceptive. The settlement, quiet and messy, did not erase the harm. It did, however, make the point that the company had acknowledged a failing and chosen to do something different. Bernard's role also meant he had to face questions he would rather avoid. He testified at hearings, met with reluctant managers, mediated disputes that smelled of old resentments. At times he felt the weight of being the man who had been forced into visibility by the worst kind of publicity. The work often exhausted him. At night he would sometimes wake listening for the rhythm of compressions in his head, a memory that both haunted and steadied him. The change he inspired came with human stories that were small and large. A security guard who had once been fired for confronting a contractor was reinstated after the welfare office investigated the contract practices. A cleaning crew that had been denied hazard pay received a back payment. A young custodian was given an apprenticeship that led to a full-time job, and the following year a promotion.
One winter, after a snowstorm closed half the city, the emergency fund paid for motel rooms for workers stranded by canceled trains. A mother who received a grant told Bernard tearfully that for the first time in years, she had slept without the cold of worry in her chest. Months into the program, the company's quarterly report included a one-page summary of the welfare office's results. The numbers were small relative to corporate revenue, but they told a human story. Emergency grants made 72 families whole, 43 managerial reviews led to policy corrections, and 3 pilot sites implemented living wage increases. The board, which had once feared the cost of change, now saw that the program improved retention and reduced the risk of scandal born of negligence. The calculus of cost had shifted away from short-term optics toward long-term stability. There were personal reconciliations that mattered most to Bernard. Fiona, whom he had initially distrusted, became an unlikely ally. She had watched the cropping of the image and had felt the shame of being part of a system that chose optics over truth. Her path to advocacy had been less visible than Bernard's. She quietly supported the transparency measures and helped create the payroll fixes that allowed the emergency fund to flow faster. They developed a working friendship that had the simplicity of two people who had seen a problem and decided to attend to it. Janet remained a steady, bright presence. She came to company events regardless of the cameras and sat in the plain rows, clapping at small victories with the kind of affection that felt like oxygen. She brought Molly over sometimes and taught her to make biscuits and told stories of long winters and the stubbornness required to survive them. The most public moment of redemption came on a cool spring evening at a small community forum held in the company's auditorium. Alexander stood at the podium first, not to take credit, but to lay a ledger of facts bare. He spoke plainly about the company's errors, about the cropped photo, and the purposeful narrative that had turned a rescue into mockery. He announced Tyler's departure and the internal reforms they had instituted. He acknowledged pain and pledged to do better. Then Bernard took the stage. He did not wear the neat suit of a CEO or the studied grief of a PR subject. He wore a cardigan he liked and a tired smile. When he spoke, he did not look for pity. He looked for action. "Thank you for showing up tonight," he said. "Not because I like attention, but because this kind of attention makes the changes stick. This work we're doing, helping people when they can't help themselves, it's not charity. It's about making sure we don't build a system that punishes the people who keep our buildings and our lives going." The crowd rose with him, not in applause alone, but in recognition. There were people who had been helped by the fund in the audience. There were teenagers who had gone through the apprenticeship program. There were workers who had once been afraid to speak out. When Bernard finished, he did not hold his hand out for accolades. Molly, sitting in the third row, smiled with the honest adoration of a child who knows her father. After the meeting, reporters gathered for the ritual of soundbites. Alexander declined most requests and instead directed people to the published reports in the public ledger of grants. He had learned the hard lesson that words without action were cheap. He had chosen to make amends in a way that required ongoing effort, rather than a one-time gesture. The months that followed were not a fairy tale. Old habits returned in places, some managers resisted the new reporting structures and tried to sidestep the welfare office. There were legal skirmishes. Tyler's lawsuit wound through the courts. But the local community and the company had created muscles of accountability that were now part of the system. Employees who once felt disposable now had an institutional advocate. Small changes added up. One late afternoon, months after the night on the stoop, Bernard and Molly stood on the small balcony of the apartment they had been able to move into because the welfare fund had paid several months' rent while he secured the job. The place was modest and smelled faintly of lemon oil, and the kind of clean that comes from a man who was raised to take pride in the ordinary. Molly leaned against the balcony rail, hair in a messy ponytail, and watched the sky turn the gray of the city toward violet. "You did good today," she said, as if it were a matter of fact. Bernard breathed a laugh that carried half pride and half disbelief. He thought of the compressions in the hush of a boardroom. He thought of the cropped image that had cut his life into a million misread pieces. He thought of a man who had fainted and then decided he would not simply buy silence. He thought of the days when the water had been turned off and there had been no extra jacket for a small girl. "We did it," he said, "not me alone." Molly leaned into him, small and certain. "Will it always be like this?" she asked, as children ask about permanence in the bluntest of ways. Bernard looked at the horizon, where the city lights were waking up. He thought of policy memos and emergency funds in the slow work of changing a corporate culture. He thought of people he had met along the way, of nights that had been lonely, and mornings that broke with a little more hope. He did not believe in guarantees. He did believe in the force of continual attention. "No," he said honestly, "but we won't let people forget people anymore." A few blocks away, Alexander sat alone for a while in his study, the photographs of his son on the shelf, and the memory of a heart that had been held in another man's hands.
He had learned that wealth made some things easier and other things harder. It let him open wallets and doors, but it did not buy the authenticity that came from acting as if life mattered more than image. He had chosen, in the days that followed, to spend his money and his authority on things that would not be easily visible in quarterly reports: emergency funds, employee autonomy, and public transparency. The work had cost him political capital, and at times, the straight, comfortable confidence of a man who manages a brand. It had given him something else, an understanding that one small refusal to let a life be consumed by a headline could change the shape of many other lives. On the anniversary of the collapse, the company published a short, unvarnished piece that listed the program's results, the lessons learned, and the names of the people who helped build the welfare office. It included a link to the full, unedited footage and a line that read, "We failed in our response. We will do better." It was not a triumphant statement. It was the brittle, honest consolation of an organization that had been forced to look at itself and was trying to act. Bernard and Molly attended a small, low-key ceremony in the company cafeteria where a modest plaque was unveiled to honor the night a life was saved and to mark a new program. Alexander stood to the side and watched as people no longer saw Bernard as a sensation, but as a colleague, a leader, a father whose practical compassion had become a design for better work. The camera lights were fewer now, less hungry. People who had once been silent now spoke, and the room felt full of the noise that indicates the beginning of repair. As the evening settled into a hush, Bernard and Molly walked back to their apartment. They talked about nothing and everything: a math test, spelling tournament, nonsense, and who would win the school soccer match. Bernard held her hand and felt the steadiness return to a life that had once felt precarious. At the doorway he paused and looked back at the tower that had once been the scene of viral cruelty. It now stood, in his sight, a more ordinary building, with tenants and lights and evening routines. He felt no triumph. He felt the quieter contentment of a man who had turned his indignation into something that would help others. He thought of the phrase that had once been used to mock him, the "kneel for cash" headline, and how the world had tried to make a life-saving act into a caricature.
He thought of the ways he had refused to let that caricature define him. In the months after, Bernard watched younger men and women enter the welfare office with urgent problems and leave with a plan. He read weekly reports that tallied small victories and small wrongs in the same ledger. He continued to get up in the dark, sweep floors, and be the kind of steady presence his dollar had always expected.
He also continued to sit in meetings and argue for dignity, for transparency, for an institutional memory that would preclude another man from being humiliated for doing the only human thing available in a moment of crisis. One evening, after a press meeting and a long day of listening to workers' stories, Bernard and Alexander shared a quiet conversation by the company garden. They did not need grand words. The work itself had become their vocabulary. They reflected on the crookedness of power and the simple, stubborn truth that small acts can become architecture. "We could make it a model," Alexander offered softly, not as boasting, but as a thought the two could consider together. Bernard considered the ache he had felt in the boardroom when cameras flashed, in the firm certainty of a man who would later call him back into the same world. He thought of his daughter, asleep in their new apartment, the smallness of their life turned toward dignity by slow, steady acts. He felt the seriousness of the offer. Greater reach, more people helped, louder scrutiny. "We make it a model by keeping it honest," Bernard said. "We don't let the headlines run it. We let the people who live it run it. We keep checks, we keep transparency, and we keep the fund out of the hands of people who only see numbers." Alexander nodded. They did not invent a perfect system that day. They did something harder. They crafted a plan they would be judged by, the kind of accountability that ensured words would become work. The work continued. Some days it was 11-hour meetings and disputes over spreadsheet lines. Some days it was the ridiculous smallness of bureaucracy. But more often, it was the luminous, ordinary work of helping a person find a place to sleep that night, making sure someone had the money for a bus to a doctor, or handling a manager who thought discipline meant silence. Years after that first night, at a small gathering to mark a new partnership between the company and a local nonprofit, Bernard stood with Molly at his side. She was older now, a little taller, and she handed out flyers helping with a community drive. People in the crowd recognized Bernard, not as a meme, but as a man who had done the messy labor of turning personal indignation into public good. When the event wound down, Bernard took Molly's hand and led her to the small balcony where they used to watch the skyline. They stood together in the evening air and looked at the lights of a city that contained many lives, some visible and some not. "You were brave," Molly said, as she always did, with the simplicity of childlike certainty that simplifies all complicated things into moral clarity. Bernard smiled, a small, tired smile. "I did what I had to do," he said, "and then I tried to make sure nobody else would have to choose between saving a life and losing everything." They stood in silence for a moment and let the city breathe around them.
The headline that had once threatened to define him, so pointed, so cruelly framed, had not been the last word. A man with resources had chosen to be accountable. A community had rallied. A program was in place. A small girl had a roof that felt less like a threat and more like shelter. The arc had bent toward repair, not because of a single headline, but because of patient, consistent attention. If this moved you, share it and subscribe for more stories of overlooked heroes and the quiet changes they inspire.